Thank you. I wish you the fruitful discussion, so I'm not muted and turn off my camera. Thank you.
So I guess we can start now. So good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome everyone to our CFA Society Ukraine Agriculture Market Outlook webinar dedicated to global agri-produce production, trade, and price outlook. And also today we will touch upon the situation with grain production and exports in Ukraine. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our today's panel. Today we have with us Will Osnatos, the Senior Research Analyst at GRO Intelligence, who has a great experience in analyzing agricultural markets globally. Also, today we have Olena Neroba, Business Development Manager and Commodity Analyst at MaxiGrain. Olena has great intelligence and experience also in global grain trade, but also a great view on Ukrainian market and current situation in Ukraine. And in a couple of minutes, our third panelists will join us. We will have also Yegor Samusenko, Head of Financial Planning and Analysis Department at Kernel Holding. Yegor will also provide more color on situation in Ukraine from the point of view of the largest grain exporter. Couple of housekeeping moments. We will start with the keynote speech by William. He will present his conclusions on the global agricultural market outlook, and then we will proceed with panel discussion. Should you have any questions on the topic, please feel free to add them to the chat section, and we will address them after the presentation. So thank you very much. With no further ado, Will, I pass the floor to you.
Great, thank you so much. Pleasure to be with all of you. Welcome welcome. Thanks for joining. And so we're going to talk about the global corn and wheat outlook and the implications for Ukraine today. So my name is Will Osnato. I'm a senior research analyst at GRO Intelligence. Before joining GRO, I was a research and trader of agricultural futures at a couple different hedge funds covering grains, oil seeds, and soft commodities. At GRO, I'm one of the team leads of a team of 29 analysts that have a pretty diverse set of backgrounds, from fertilizer specialists to produce. We work alongside our data science teams, as well as our climate and geospatial teams that collect, analyze, and build models on a wide set of data. Here's our agenda for today. First, we'll start off with just a brief introduction to GRO, so you know where all this is coming from. We'll move to an overview of the current wheat market conditions before discussing the outlook specifically for Ukraine. Next, we'll take a little deeper dive into the global corn market, covering the EU and US corn conditions, as well as China and Brazil. And then again, we'll take a closer look at the Ukraine and the outlook there. And finally, we'll highlight a few key things to follow in the coming months. We're going to cover a lot of ground, and this is obviously a large topic with interconnected pieces. So do submit questions via the panel, and we'll have a discussion to follow. So hopefully we'll get to all of this. So a quick introduction to GRO for people not familiar with our group. Put simply, GRO is an AI-powered decision engine that covers climate, agriculture, and the economy. We've built a platform that leverages the power of our domain experts and analyst team to curate our data and design analytics. Our engineers and data scientists drive the AI that powers those insights and analytics. And then we cut through vast amounts of information and make it actionable. And we make all of this available through our GRO portal web application, the GRO API, and our growing suite of apps. And like I said, the GRO platform is created by human intelligence and then scaled by the artificial intelligence that gives you honest, objective answers to what's going on in agriculture and climate. We've leveraged this domain expertise to create 28 proprietary data frameworks that generate over 16,000 data sets and 2 million data series. And that's allowed GRO and our customers to use these data-driven forecasts to understand the complex real-world system that we live in. So now let's take a look at the global wheat market conditions. So I wanted to start with a price chart going back to the beginning of 2021, just to sort of set the stage of where we are now. Now, the wheat market was getting increasingly tight over 2021, reflected, and you can see that steadily rising prices from the far left of the chart. The biggest issue last year was the major drought in North America that cut 20 million tons of production. There was also strong demand from China, which has emerged as a leading importer. Also, the Middle East had production issues, and they're traditionally a very large importing region, but they were importing record amounts in 2021 as well. So this created a very tight supply dynamic for wheat and really set the stage for that explosive price reaction when the invasion of Ukraine happened. So you can see that really sharp move, several limit up days, extreme volatility. But that was really set up by the previous year of extremely tight wheat market conditions. Now we're back, have come off back to pre-invasion levels. A lot of that has to do with macroeconomic risk-off assets and energy stocks, et cetera. But we'll also highlight a few things that happened in the fundamentals of the wheat market. So I'm going to start with India, which had at one point looked like it was a positive for the market. It was in good position to fill some of the gap in exports. They had built up a very large surplus of wheat on the back of 5 consecutive crops. So on the left, you'll see the blue line is their production going up, 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 and then the green bars are the stocks. So they had just a string of great weather and built up this huge stocks and were ready to export. You can see on the right, the export bars in blue. They had come off in 2021 a record level of exports, but they had a severe heat wave in April, which cut what looks to be almost 10 million tons off of this last crop. So again, back to the blue line on the left, that's a sharp dip. That was expected to be a new record, and then that forecast changed. The export sales had been off to a very strong start, and suddenly the government had to step in and ban exports in mid-May, and then further ban flour exports more recently, because you can see those green bars on the left starting to project a fall, and they had record high prices. So, and just to flip back 1 second, that's where you got to this very, very peak level. That was mid-May when India banned exports. Another poor area was the EU. The extreme heat at the end of the crop took several million tons off of production. What we're looking at here is crop-weighted, wheat-weighted NDVI. NDVI is a vegetative health satellite indicator. That's a very good indicator for yield. So you can see the red lines. This is the last 22 years of data in a seasonal chart. The red line this season, right at that peak, was right in the middle, so everything looked average. And then that high heat at the end of the crop pushed this indicator down to the lowest on record. And so it was pretty obvious from this indicator that production forecasts were going to get cut. That high heat continued, and drought continued to significantly impact the corn crop, which I'll get into a little bit later. Other things supporting the market, I mentioned the Middle East had a drought in 2021. They had another second consecutive drought in their key wheat growing regions. This is actually a pretty big wheat growing area, as well as a big importing area. So you can see on the left, that's actually Grow's proprietary drought index, which is a daily index. So you can see back in March, which is a key growing period for them, how widespread and severe the drought on a scale of 0 to 5 is. A lot of dark red there. So on the right, you see their annual imports. It's obviously a big importing region, but these last 2 seasons have been exceptionally high. So you're at the same time you lost some supply, you're increasing demand. Similarly, in North Africa, there was severe droughts there as well. Morocco in particular lost 5 million tons of production off of a 7.5 million tons the previous year, so quite severe decline. You can see on the right, again, we're looking at wheat weighted NDVI. So that red line, basically at the bottom of the chart on around March, shows one of the worst crops they've ever had. And so that's, again, predicting that they were going to drop, that was going to drop. And that's exactly what happened. The lower right chart is our drought index in a line form. So for most of the beginning of the season during their wheat growing period, they had the worst drought in 20 years. So another area that, again, Egypt's the largest importing country in the world, but North Africa is another, North Africa and Middle East combined are the largest importing regions. So you're having production problems there, just increasing the level of demand. Now, there were some positives. I mentioned North America had a severe drought in 2021. And on the left, you can see the Canadian production, that bar, that very low bar, the second to last one. So production is set to rebound quite a bit. So the North American spring wheat crops look excellent. Canada is likely to have record exports off of the back of this pretty large crop. And the US spring wheat conditions you see on the right are above average. That dashed line in the middle is average. So the conditions are pretty good. So quite basically the opposite of what happened last season. Australia is another source of good production. They're coming off the back of a record crop, that second to last bar. And that's going to lead to record exports. They're just getting started with their next crop. That looks pretty good. So this is going to be 3 consecutive years of very strong crops corresponding with 3 La Nina seasons. Australia is highly susceptible to El Nino, La Nina fluctuations. So, and you can see the very poor years back in 2017, 2018, 2019 El Nino years. So this has been a good good source of exports and offsets some of the demand in Asia that otherwise fills some of the gap that we're missing in other areas, particularly that North American lack of Canadian crop last year. Russia is another that this has been one of the things that has probably led to some of the price decline, is that Russia is having a good crop, but specifically forecasts for their crop have increased sharply over the last month or two. Private forecasters there are expecting crops of, say, 94 to 96 million tons, and that's even well above what the USDA is saying right now. I've heard some speculation that since they couldn't export as much fertilizer as normal, they dumped a bunch of it on the crop. Yields, we have a winter wheat yield model at Grow, and that was indicating sort of 5-6% increase in yield. That doesn't fully explain the increase in production. One question I would have is unclear how much grain from the Ukraine and occupied areas is basically being counted in this total. But regardless, expectations of this crop have increased. What we're seeing on the right, what I'm showing on the right, is that there is still a spring wheat crop, and Kazakhstan's crop is a spring wheat crop. So what we're looking at is that NDVI, that vegetative health, and we're looking at a map as a difference from normal. So all that white is basically normal. Orange is worse than normal. Green is better than normal. So and this is specifically the spring wheat area for Russia. And so the crops don't look great, but not that poor. So it's not, I wouldn't expect the forecast for Russia or Kazakhstan to get particularly better at this point. The forecasts for Kazakhstan aren't that exciting. They're better than last year, but nothing huge. Now, the question, though, is can Russia export this crop? There's obviously plenty of sanctions. And between July and August, their exports are down 27% from last year. So coming off of a record crop, as big a crop as they supposedly have, that's not a great start. But you've seen some signs recently that the exports are freeing up. Egypt, for example, just made a direct purchase from Russia. of 240,000 tons. Bangladesh secured the ability to import wheat and fertilizers through banking certificates. So, and given the worldwide food security issues and high inflation prices, yeah, it wouldn't be surprising that a lot of countries are just going to find a way to get the wheat from Russia, since Russia is the largest source of exports. And it's kind of hard to say that somewhere like the U.S. is going to say you can't import food when to Africa, where you're having severe food security issues. So the wheat will get out. It's just a question of how much exactly is going to be able to flow. So that leads us to this chart, which I use quite a bit. It's a very useful statistic. Stocks to use, which you sort of amongst major exporters. So you add up the ending stocks, the projected ending stocks across these countries, and divide it by total use. It gives you a nice normalized indicator of basically relative supply and demand. It also is highly correlated to price for the year. So like I said, this measurement was the tightest since 2008, before the war started. And that is, again, why you saw such an explosive reaction when the invasion happened. And sort of just to summarize all the things we just went over, this hasn't changed. This is still the tightest, if you by any measurement, still the tightest since 2008. I even added in a chart where you include India amongst the major exporters, even though they're not typically one. And again, however you're reading it across these major sources of global supply, it's extremely tight, and nothing about production in the very current season, which world production is expected to basically be flat. We're not going to grow our way out of it this season. Like I said, some of the price has come off with those positive views of the Russia production. The export corridor opening was obviously a positive, and we'll get into that later as well. But this underlies sort of everything, which is that it's still an extremely tight supply-demand balance, and it will take more than that will be very supportive of prices, I would say, through all of next season, so well into next year. It takes more than one crop cycle to sort of recover from how tight this is. So I think prices will be well supported for a while. Now, getting into Ukraine specifically, Ukraine's production 2021 was a record high, and obviously much lower this season. Yields were down a bit, but really it's about the harvested acreage. 6.5 million hectares were sown, only 5 million are going to be harvested. That leaves anywhere from 3 to 5 million tons unaccounted for in occupied areas. And like I mentioned before, I don't know if that's effectively ending up in Russia's total, but the harvest is basically done. So 19.5 million is the total. And you can see on that blue bar, well down from last year. Here we're looking at monthly exports on a seasonal basis. So obviously the invasion disrupted exports when the ports were shut. So that's that line with blocks at the bottom. So that actually meant the end of the season of the previous record crop didn't fully get shipped out. And then so far this season, starting July 1, so for 2 months, there's only been 1 million tons of exports. Exporters are prioritizing corn because there's leftover corn also from the previous record crop. But the backdrop really, again, is that there is a serious need for the wheat. Prices will remain high. So it's just going to be a question of how much Ukraine can ship over the next couple of months, and how much they'll be able to benefit from those high prices and frankly just get the grain out and free up space for the new crops. And when you look at it on a sort of an annual basis, and looking at the overall prospects, The lost production is obviously going to severely reduce exports for the coming season. That's the blue line. So the export projection is going to be sharply lower because of that loss of production. So the price will be there, but even with improving logistics and assuming that continues for a while, the supply is just not there. The green bars are those ending stocks. So you did see a buildup in stocks because those exports were disrupted for the last couple of months. But the projection of ending stocks at the end of this season, so next end of June, are lower due to the lower production. And then the further issue potentially could be another reduction in area, or they're about to start seeding the winter wheat. If there's a further reduction in area, that is going to severely limit export potential for next year. So while the prices will be high, the Ukrainian farmers are not going to be able to benefit from the high global prices, and at the same time, the world will badly miss this needed grain. So it's an unfortunate situation. Shifting gears to corn. So again, we're going to zoom back out to the global level, and again, start with a price chart to set the stage of where we are. So similar to wheat, prices have been rising for a while. A bit of a different issue in the middle of 2021 was a major drought in Brazil that slashed production. Prices leveled off. So this is the Brazil drought here that leveled off with a decent US crop. And then the invasion sort of accelerated this rise. And it's actually right here that caused a jump in prices of corn. This is the U.S. planting intentions report that showed a surprisingly low amount of acres being planted to corn, in large part due to high fertilizer prices. So you got this jump up to the highest levels of prices. And again, you get to sell off with the rest of the global risk assets. And then you've seen a more recent rise in prices due to this season's concern about the U.S. crop. So we're going to take a little bit of a look at the U.S. crop. Again, we're looking at NDVI, a vegetative health chart, better or worse than normal. So all that orange on the left. There have been a pretty severe drought in the plains and western United States that had creeped in to significantly impact the corn crop in the western part of the Corn Belt. And even besides that, there's been high heat. It's kind of a theme in a lot of areas, but high heat across the U.S. Is creating variability even in the better areas. So the concern about the U.S. crop is very much supporting prices recently as people come to realize that the crop is not as good as everyone thought initially. Part of what goes into that, I want to highlight that GROW has several yield models across corn, wheat, and soybeans in major producing regions. So you can see our U.S. corn yield model in blue on the right. It updates daily throughout the season. So it's giving you a good indication, basically right from the beginning, that yield prospects were significantly lower than the starting point. And the orange line is where the USDA forecast is. So they were just starting a trend at 177. So we were showing that it was significantly lower than that basically all season. The USDA doesn't typically update their US numbers till August when they have some surveys from farmers. And actually there's a big report on Monday, is their September report, which will be the first report that incorporates actual field data. And we expect them to cut yields again. And that's sort of been backed up by crop tours and other private analysts, but specifically our yield model has been showing that it's well below that. So we expect them to cut. Whether or not that causes the prices to rise further really is on what how much people expect them to cut. Whether they surprise, but again, this is the first time they're going to be incorporating objective field data into their forecast. So it's kind of a big report on Monday. The EU is another area of concern. I mentioned previously that the high heat and drought impacted the end of the wheat crop. It devastated their corn crop. So again, we're looking at NDVI weighted by corn area across the entire EU. So basically the vegetative health indicator as the worst in 22 years. Their crop prospects were slashed. The EU is a major importing region. Those expectations of imports are already increasing. They could end up being the single largest importing region, possibly surpassing China, and I'll explain more on that. They import a lot from the Ukraine. So again, that outlet will be there if Ukraine can get some of their crop out. Now, again, switching to the positive side, China's crop looks quite good. We don't get great statistics out of China, so we use what we can. On the right, again, NDVI better than normal. That's very green. The Northeast China is where the bulk of the corn is grown. That looks quite good. There have been some headlines recently about drought in China. That's in the southern regions. That does not particularly impact corn. So their corn crop looks quite good. And you can sort of verify that. On the left, I have a chart of cash prices in corn in China on average and the Dalian futures prices. So the blue line of cash prices is sitting at a 6-month low. It is also interesting. I again made this chart back to 2020, so you can see when the prices really started to rise drastically, and that's when China emerged as the largest importer in the world, starting in mid 2020. But now with the prices tapering off a little bit, the crop looks good. So you kind of need to triangulate a few of these things to figure out how much they're going to import. And I'll just mention their imports as something to follow at the end. Another positive, Brazil managed a record crop. I mentioned in 2021, their crop was devastated by drought. That's this dip in production right here. It's jumped up. There was some drought concerns at the beginning of the year, but the second crop of Brazil, which is the larger crop and what they use to export, it was excellent. So they're hitting a huge crop. That's really going to be the main source of supply. On the right, we can see their monthly exports just in August reached an absolute record of any month. So they're off to a strong start. And then very initial projections for their next crop will be a new record as area continues to expand, particularly as soybean area expands and they plant the second crop of corn after the soybeans. That acreage is going to just keep increasing, and really the only thing that stops Brazil from new record crops every year is if they experience a drought, which you see in these dips. So that's a positive source, balancing some of these lower production. So again, looking at stocks to use to sum this all up, had been quite tight a few years ago and looked like it was getting better. And the blue line is the USDA stocks to use. But like I said, the USDA is using a probably too high US yield. So if you were to sub in grows yield and the orange line, you get a major exporter stocks to use decline. And then on top of that, world production overall is forecast to decline year over year for the first time in 5 years. So it looks like it's getting tighter this season. And again, that will support prices through until we basically see the prospects of the next Brazil crop in say the first quarter and into the second quarter. So jumping into Ukraine again. So this is a chart of the monthly exports. They had a record crop in 2021 that they were, and those supplies were disrupted by the invasion, those exports. So quite a bit of corn backed up. And that's why the exporters, there's several million tons of corn backed up there. And that's partly why the exporters are trying to push that now to make room for the wheat crop, let alone the next corn crop that's going to be harvested coming up soon. looking a little bit deeper on that change in production for this season. On the left, you see, again, NDVI looking spectacular for that record crop in 2021. And then on the right, mixed for this past season. So yield, not surprisingly, was closer to average. But the bigger issue was, again, acreage. And this was the farmers trying to plant after the war had started. So the acreage was reduced almost by 20%. And so that's a more significant thing. So you're coming off of a record yields to more moderate yields, and then a significant decrease in acreage. And that's resulting in what you see on the blue bars of a significant reduction in production. That green yield line shows that the yield wasn't bad, but again, the loss of area is dropping production. So it's generally a similar story to wheat in that with significantly reduced production, you're going to have significantly reduced export potential. So on the right, the blue bars are the forecast for exports. The far right bar being the forecast for this current season that's just getting started. The one difference between wheat and corn is that those green bars of stocks, those are significantly higher for corn. Those stocks, like I said, built up from the previous record crop and are expected to build up again with this crop. So if you assume absolute best case export logistics for quite a while, it's theoretically possible that there are additional supplies that could increase that export potential, but that's quite a distance in front of us. So I want to have just a few last couple of things to watch over the next couple of months. Obviously, I haven't talked about the grain initiative of the export corridor. That's obviously been a big story of everybody's following extremely closely. And part of the reason that's been more optimism in the wheat market a bit. So just looking at some stats that the Ministry of Infrastructure provided for the first month, 1.7 million tons shipped. What's been interesting is that just this past week, another 34 ships, or so far in September, have left. So it's another 600,000 tons of agricultural products. So that's off to a good start. That's somewhat promising. Ministry of Agriculture thinks the shipments in September, vessel shipments will be 3 million tons, with ideas that the vessel shipments can eventually get to 4 million tons, with total ag exports in October in the 6 to 6.5 million ton range. That's on the optimistic side. On the pessimistic side, there were also missile attacks on the grain port terminals that's destroying silos. This agreement also expires in November. You had comments out of Russia that the supplies are not going to countries in need. So there's just rumblings. Anything can happen. It's fragile, but so far the actual shipments of vessels are moving. So that's a positive. I mentioned China earlier, something to follow. This is their corn imports. So why this is important is that they basically run down stocks to minimal levels. They had used to have a huge government surplus. So now the health of their crop in any given year could drastically swing the level of imports that they're going to need. And they're the largest importer in the country. So if their crop was actually quite good, as it sort of indicates on the satellite imagery, maybe they need less than 23 million tons of exports, and maybe significantly less. So that's something to follow, and we're not really going to know except for following their actual imports, and that can make up for more than outweigh the need of additional imports to the EU. So that's something to watch. And one last key thing. Winter wheat sowing, that's going to be coming up for Ukraine, EU, US. So Ukraine to start, some initial expectations out of the Ministry of Agriculture that it could be down 20% again from this reduced area that was harvested just recently. That's not great news. I've seen some other estimates of could be down as high as 30 to 40%. That would severely limit export potential in 2023 and the season starting then, if you just don't have the capability of producing a big crop. So that's definitely something to watch, how much can actually get planted. For the EU and the US, it's more about weather. On the map, again, you can see on the right is our drought index. The drought is persisting in the EU. So the question is how long will the drought last? How dry will the area be? Does that reduce planted area for the EU, or just be bad planting conditions to start off for the crop? So that's something to watch just to see how that develops. And it's similar story in the US hard red winter wheat area, still under severe drought conditions. So those are the last few things to think about. So I covered a lot there. I didn't even get to talk about the impact of high fertilizer prices and the serious threats to food security in a number of countries, particularly importing countries in places like Africa. But hopefully that gave us plenty to talk about. You have some good questions and stuff we can discuss on the panel. So thank you very much.
Perfect. Will, thank you very much for this deep dive into the market situation and outlook. That was really great. I guess we will start our panel discussion now. So I'll also encourage our audience to add their questions to the chat section so we can address them. And to start with, I will start with a quick follow-up with William, based on your presentation. You've indeed mentioned that there are a number of moving parts to watch for the next season, including the weather conditions, the planted area in Ukraine for the next year, also the demand from China. You also mentioned the high fertilizer prices, and based on your gut feeling, could you please range those factors by the importance? Which one would be the most material for the end of this season and the next one?
Yeah, I mean, for me, when I saw those expectations that Ukraine it could further reduce the planted area 20 to 40%, and that's due to sort of a lack of resources. That's pretty significant just in terms of tonnage. Typically, compared to, say, the drought in the EU, there's been plenty of years where it's very dry ahead of planting season for winter wheat, and the farmers will get their crop in. There'll be enough rain, and the dry conditions really maybe just take your best potential of the crop off the table. But there's so much more weather to go for wheat crops just at the beginning of planting. The idea that you significantly reduced area doesn't happen that often. So, but when you're talking about the Ukraine very likely to reduce planted acreage further, that's and that seems more confident. That's pretty concerning, because that's another, say, 5 to 8 million tons of potential off the market. That, again, assuming logistics are good and you can eventually get that grain out, it's not even going to be there. So that's pretty concerning.
Sure. Thank you very much. So probably let's start a little bit deeper into situation in Ukraine. So I will probably ask Alena and Igor about the grain harvest outlook for this season, and probably your tentative expectations for the next season. So as Will said, we almost complete harvesting of wheat. It's 19 million tons, which Agriculture Ministry reported so far. It's about 40% down year over year. What are your expectations about the late crops harvest this year? And do you also expect farmers to cut their plantings for the next season? Probably we will start with Alena, and Igor, you are welcome to jump in.
Thank you for your question. Firstly, I have to mention that, William, you mentioned that you think that current drought in Europe could influence on the acreage. But nowadays there is a rain all over the Europe, so I don't expect that weather condition will have the most the first stage in acreage question. I think that fertilizer will take the first stage. And if we come back to Ukrainian numbers, as you mentioned, Ukraine already finished harvesting of early grains. They are wheat. We already harvested more than 90 million tons, metric tons. It's 40% less than previous season. Previous season was like a record for Ukraine. We harvested 32.5 million metric tons of wheat. But this significant decrease is not just a decrease in numbers due to some obstacles while in the beginning of the spring. All of us know these obstacles. Farmers didn't do what they have to do in the fields in time and in full volume. So it leads to correction between feed wheat and milling wheat. So usually Ukraine produces like 65 up to 75% of milling wheat, and the rest is feed wheat. This year we will have like 50-50. It means that we usually export a lot of milling wheat, and demand for Ukrainian feed wheat is lower because we have two big producers from all the borders. We are between two big producers, between Russia and Europe, which are leader on the market. Russia this season officially will produce around 90 million tons, but it's bunker weight, it's not clear weight. After cleaning, it will like 82 million tons. It's another record for Russia, and about 5 million tons they will already stolen from Ukraine. I think they include this number in their expectation. And on the west part, we have Europe, which is the biggest world producer and as well exporter. So these 90 million tons plus 5 million tons which are unsold from the previous season because of the war. So we expect, in positive scenario, we expect that Ukraine could export 70 million tons versus 25 million tons for previous season expectation. So it's more than enough to supply world and countries which need this grain. And if we're talking about grain corridor, as of yesterday evening, more than 100 vessels already left Ukrainian ports carrying 2.135, something like that, metric tons of different crops. Mostly, as on today, it's corn. But what Russia did yesterday, they just manipulate numbers, because traditionally Ukraine exports in the second part of marketing season, which is spring and midsummer, mostly corn, because we produce more corn, we export more corn than wheat. And in the second part of the season, we traditionally export more corn than wheat. So nothing
unusual.
Yeah, sorry, nothing unusual here. And from these 100 vessels which already left Ukrainian ports, 18, it's a vessel which were loaded before the war, and they traditionally carrying corn. It was mostly Panamax size vessel, big size vessel, so we can cut it from all statistic, and then we see that 80 vessels carrying from 80 vessels which left Ukrainian ports since the beginning of the grain corridor, 22 carrying wheat. So it's good number. It's 25%. And if you talk about volumes, it's 30% of what Ukraine exports via grain corridor. But market reacted yesterday very straight. CBOT, it's a main exchange for agriculture product in the world. It's Chicago Board of Trading. They rise sharply, even it wasn't a trading time. It was before the trading time due to time difference. So as on today, markets expect trade very accurate, very step by step. They do not trade like future deals, the forward deals. They just make deals on spot market, which means as on today, as on tomorrow or week ahead, not further. So let me explain from the very beginning why it's very important to look the country which highlighted William. If we talk about China, for Ukraine, it's a wheat market and barley market. Ukraine is the main supplier for corn for China. And since the beginning of Chinese rebuilding stocks for rebuilding pig production, because they had African swine fever a few years ago and have to cut almost half of pigs in the country. So they was need to rebuild these numbers. So they started to buy corn at extremely high levels, like 3 times more than usually. In those times in Ukraine, it was 2 years ago, we have drought and our production declined sharply. So it wasn't enough corn to supply for China. So they came back for 1 season to the US. Brazil, which is one of the world's bigger corn producer, as you saw in the number by William, they can't supply to China because of phytosanitary. They don't have phytosanitary agreement. And now China is avoid to buy Ukrainian corn even via corridor, because they expect that something could happen, and now we see that it could happen. So they started to negotiate to Brazil to launch, to sign this agreement and to launch corn imports from Brazil. So Chinese market is very important to us, and I disagree as Ukrainian that current Chinese good weather conditions and good NDVI is a good sign. For Ukraine, it's not good sign, because as they have enough grain, they will not buy. And very important to, when we talk about China, very important to check how much pigs they produce, how much pork consumption is, because all grain supplying to China very sensitive to pork market. If we talk about barley, Ukraine is the leader. It's the second number 2 in the world in barley trading. We have two big buyers. They are China and Saudi Arabia. For today, Saudi Arabia trying to substitute Ukrainian barley with Australian origin because of political issues. Now Australia has bad relationship with China, so they can't supply their barley to China. China set 83% duty to the Australian barley. So Australia started to export barley to Saudi Arabia, and there is no room for Ukrainian barley anymore. So I think that for Ukrainian farmers, it's a good opportunity to cut areas. So in barley case, what happens? It's okay, because the world doesn't need Ukrainian barley for the moment. And as well, we already harvested 100% of rapeseed area. We produce around 3 million tons. It depends on year on weather. We produce around 3 million metric tons of rapeseed. Mostly all Ukrainian rapeseeds exported to the European Union, where they produce biodiesel from it. It's a winter type of diesel. They use it in the winter time because in summertime they use diesel from palm oil or from soybean oil, and in winter times from rapeseed, because rapeseed biodiesel can work with very low temperatures. So usually all Ukrainian rapeseed exported during the first 3 months after harvesting, and then Ukraine jumped to exports of another crops. As on later crops, now we already started to harvest sunflower seeds and corn. It's just a very few hectares, so it's just the beginning. It's a normal time for Ukraine to start harvesting in the mid of September. We expect that due to cut of areas but same time due to good weather, Ukraine will produce around 30 million metric tons of corn, which is great result because 3 years ago when we have drought, areas was much higher and we produced just 35 million metric tons. So 30, it's really good numbers according current situation. And about sunflower seeds, which is very sensitive and important for Ukrainian economy, I think Yegor will add more information about it because Kernel is the world leader of crushing of sun seeds. We expect about 10 million metric tons of sun seeds this season versus 17 previous season is a record for all Ukrainian corn. On average, we harvested around 14 million metric tons of sunseed. Sunseed very sensitive to grain corridor as well, because after the beginning of the war, when Ukrainian ports, which are main gates for Ukrainian exports, ports were blocked, and almost all Ukrainian crushers stopped their production. They monthly Ukraine crush usually around 1.5 million metric tons of sunseeds. Nowadays we crush before the grain corridor opening. We crushed like 300,000 metric tons, which is 5 times less, because we can't export it. Now we already launched almost full capacity of crushing. I know that the biggest producer already started to buy seeds from producers. We have in stocks from the previous season around 2.5 million metric tons of seeds. So it's not very critical for Ukrainian producers compared to average crop. This crop 10 million plus 2 million tons from stocks from the previous one, so 12. It's not like a tragedy. If we talk about soybeans, Ukraine is a small player. It's for Ukraine. We are not big producer. We produce like another 3 million metric tons of soybeans, half of which we usually crush inside country, and half we export to our neighbors like Turkey, which is a bigger buyer. What I have mentioned, and for the next season, we already in good progress of rapeseed planting. Rapeseed is the first crop which we harvest in the season. It's like a mid-June, mid-July, and the first crop which we plant usually. Then we already start to plant winter wheat. I agree with William number that winter wheat area will fall to 3.8 million hectares. It's not just because of the war, it's because of Ukraine have a huge stock and Ukrainian farmers can't pay for all inputs which they need to buy, especially fuel, for fertilizers and crop protections in chemistry. They have seeds because Ukraine is self-sufficient in sun seeds and wheat seeds. But the key problem is fertilizer. For wheat is very important to use fertilizers, and winter crop is the main crop for Ukraine. 99.9% of Ukrainian wheat is winter crop. In spring, we plant usually 200 hectares. It's like 6.5 of winter, 6.5 million hectares of winter crop, and 2,000, it's nothing. So this will not change for this season. And as I mentioned, for barley, we expect as well cutting in areas. Rapeseed area will be on same level or even will increase, because rapeseed is one of the most valuable crop for Ukrainian farmers. It's very difficult to produce it. Not all farmers know how to produce. Not all farmers have conditions to produce it. Not all farmers have equipment to produce rape seeds, but those who can, they earn really good money, especially for the last few seasons when prices increase sharply. Maybe I have to mention that sun seeds, soybeans, and rapeseeds, it's a veg oils product, and they are very sensitive to the cost, to the oil price, because you can substitute oil with biofuels, which you can produce from vegetable oil. Same for corn. Corn you can use to feed animals for animal production, like pigs, cows, poultry, to produce poultry. And half of corn, for example, 40% in the US, used to produce ethanol. It's a substitute to substitute oil. And if you talk about barley and wheat, it's a grains which consumed for feed, animal feeding, or if you talk about wheat by itself, half or even more than half, so 65% of world wheat consumed by humans. So timely, you can substitute grains between each other, like some 25% of wheat could be substituted by corn in animal form, in animal feeding formula, but not all. And this time we have on the market, on the table, two different types of biofuel policies. The US agreed to produce biofuels from all types of raw materials, like they agreed to produce biofuels from soybeans and from corn. Same time, Europe avoid nowadays to produce biofuels from food. They say that we can't burn food. So it's different type of policy, government policy, and like they are opposite to each other. And it's very important to understand who is your buyer and who is your counterparty. If you talk about Europe, in the nearest future, I think the demand on rapeseed will decrease. That means that Ukrainian producers in the nearest future should decrease areas, but not now. For this season, demand will be good as well as for few previous.
Perfect. Alena, thank you very much for this deep describal of the Ukrainian grain market and outlook. So, Igor, what's your take on that? What's your expectations on the harvest, and what's your view on the current grain exports from Ukraine via the grain corridor?
Well, I would just briefly add that I agree with Alena and William that Ukrainian harvest will decrease this year because acreage is significantly lower. Farmers couldn't apply as much inputs and as good quality inputs that they would usually apply this season as they applied in the previous seasons, and also because farmers have shifted some of the acreage from higher yield corn to lower yield soybeans. Because of that, Ukrainian harvest will decrease. What we have seen changing within last couple of months is our expectations for corn yield, which is growing up in Ukraine because of the weather conditions, and that will partially compensate decrease in the acreage. But obviously, Ukrainian crop will be significantly lower. But combining with the high beginning stocks that we have at the beginning of the season, we still will have probably the highest ever problem of storing grain that farmers produce. That's why harvest pressure will be quite significant, first of all for the storage, from the storage perspective. And grain corridor is helping here quite significantly, as well as investments that many small and medium and large traders have made into transshipment facilities along the border with Poland, Romania, Hungary, and at the ports of Rini and Izmail. What we have seen from the export data in August that it is not only grain corridor that is adding extra volume for Ukrainian grain exports, we have seen an increase in grain exports through all the channels that we currently have. The new ports have been able to ship record volumes of grain. There is record amount of grain shipped using rail cars, and trucks have, which is extremely inefficient way to export any type of commodities. They have been used to export more than 600,000 tons of grain from Ukraine, which is almost a half of what we have reached through the grain corridor. So definitely Ukrainian export has recovered up, and even without the grain corridor, we have reached quite significant volumes, which would help to export a significant portion of Ukrainian harvest, even in the case if grain corridor is closed at a certain moment.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And could you explain a little bit how the big traders currently treating this grain corridor? Is it like a bonus, and still huge efforts are being put into investments in the alternative export routes, including railway, including through the Danube River? Or is there like expectations in the market that seaborne grain trade will continue going forward at solid volumes?
I didn't see any grain trader has any better visibility on the likelihood of the grain corridor being continued or not. This is just something that no grain trader can affect on. Obviously, everyone who is doing any type of trading business takes into account the risk that the grain corridor could be closed at any moment. And this is important to understand for any trader's activity. Well, obviously, large traders, they have more facilities and more experience of working with deep sea water ports than smaller traders that have been quite successful at the small transshipment facilities with Poland, Romania, and Hungary, and at the new ports. Opening grain corridor is a huge relief for many large grain traders, as Cardinal and other international players as well.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. And another question to Igor and to Elena as well. For the current seaborne grain exports from Ukraine, what obstacles do you see exporters are currently facing? At the beginning of the corridors start working, we were discussing lack of insurance, like lack of vessels, lack of everything. So everything was under questions. As of now, we see that the process is going quite okay at this point, but are there any major challenges still in place?
As in today, more than 100 vessels already applied to grain corridor for the next month. So it's a good sign. We already do not have obstacles on insurance side. I mean, it's an obstacle still because it's too expensive, but we already agreed it. Market already agreed it between participants. The key problem is that freight is too expensive. It's like difference between freight from Ukraine, for example, to Turkey, and from Romania to Turkey is around $10 per metric ton. It's a huge difference. So Ukrainian farmers will not get this $10. Plus, not all export port facilities are operating now, and those who are operating increased the cost of FOBing. It's a cost of loading grain from the silo to the vessel, or from loading some oil from the storage to tanker. It increased more than two times, and few duties as well increased by Ukraine and by Turkey. Still, the main obstacle is uncertainty. Will corridor operate tomorrow? I mean, not tomorrow directly, but in nearest future. So and the risk of floating mine.
Igor, would you like to add something on this point?
Yeah, I fully agree with Elena. I would just probably add that one of the things that could help to increase the volumes for the grain corridor is that if we utilize larger size vessels, but again, to be able to achieve that, we just have some time to happen, and we just have to wait. So the owners of the larger size vessels, they would agree to the risks that they have when they go to Ukrainian ports. And obviously some kind of solutions in terms of insurance, they would help a lot for these owners of larger size vessels to accept these risks better.
Mhm. Perfect. And just small follow-up on this. We saw that Panamax in Ukrainian ports became more kind of routine, and we saw one Cape-size vessel left Port of Yuzhny. That was the vessel that was stuck there from before the war. And do you expect more Cape-size vessels to enter our ports?
It's not Cape-size. It's very rare to deliver grain by Cape-size vessels. I remember previous season 2. Yeah, Cargill from Brazil loaded soybean meal on Cape-size vessel, and I don't remember who else, but it's an unusual stuff for Ukraine, for all the world to deliver grain by Cape-size vessel for nowadays. Ukrainian ports now left all the vessels which stuck from the beginning of the war, except one. It's you will know which vessel I talk about. There are an investigation about this vessel, not about Ukrainian grain, but just about vessel. I think this is just a matter of time. From this vessel, from this 100 vessel which left Ukrainian ports, we saw few new coming Panamax-size vessel, but in full capacity, they could be loaded just in port of Chornomorsk and partly in port of Odessa. Port of Pivdenny still can't load old Panamax-size vessels because of draw. There are some cat barges there, and they can't load. If it's old vessel, they have deeper draft. New vessel, more modern vessels have not such big draft, even Panamax size, so they can't be loaded. But so it's very sensitive question for freight market as well. And as Igor mentioned, very important to see a lot of Panamax, because Panamax size vessels coming to Ukraine means that we launched trading with East-South Asia, which are Ukrainian, one of biggest Ukrainian buyers. Bangladesh and Indonesia, Pakistan, it's our wheat market, and corn is, and barley, it's Chinese market. So if they come back, it will be a good sign. As on today, I know that already prices fall, and Brazilian traders told me that during the previous week, Brazilian, European, and Asian, which is very important, buyers wash out at around 500,000 Brazilian corn, which means that they will turn back to Ukrainian corn. So we expect in next month around 500,000 of new contracts for Ukrainian corn, which is a great sign. And we already started to deliver sun oil to India, which is great sign as well.
Absolutely. Thank you on that. Just a small follow-up on the exports of sunflower oil. This question going to be to Yegor. Earlier this week, we saw the announcement by Ukraine's agriculture ministry about the plans to build a pipeline to transport sunflower oil to Polish port of Gdansk. Do you see this idea viable? Do you support this idea?
I haven't seen actually the idea itself, so I would probably not comment much on that. But definitely the most cost-efficient way to export oil would be using large-size vessels through Ukrainian ports.
Perfect. So So the quick reminder to our audience, should you have any questions, please feel free to drop them to the chat and we will address them to the speakers. And while we wait for some questions, another question I would to ask, probably coming back to Will, what would be on the grain exports from Russia? You've mentioned earlier during your presentations that, for example, wheat export volumes from Russia have dropped partially due to sanctions. And this also would be a question to all other speakers, because we do understand there are no direct sanctions on the export of Russia's grains. There were kind of side effects complicating signing the fleet, insuring the fleet, etc. And how do you expect the grain exports from Russia to develop?
I'll certainly defer to the to the other speakers, but that's what it is. It's sorting out finances, insurance, and that was the news from Bangladesh that they basically just got lines of credit secured to be able to to just be able to finance those purchases, which I without having a lot of details, I'll be interested what the you and Elena say, but in situations like this, when the global market's this tight, the wheat will find a way to get out. The prices are too high, and the market really needs it, so it tends to find a way to get out.
So, Elena, what's your view on the situation?
The biggest problem of Russia is Russia by itself. They set duties, export duties on wheat a few years ago, as well as they launched to tell how much each seller can sell during season. It's quotas. They launched quotas as well, and Russian farmers disagree to sell because current prices fall after grain corridor start operating. Prices fall on harvest pressure. Prices fall as supply significantly increase, and Canadian crop is quite good. Or as well, Northern Hemisphere expect really, South Hemisphere expect really great crop. Australia probably will set another record, and they will start harvesting in a few months. So now it's a really harvest pressure, and prices fall. Same time, cost of inputs still very high, and between these numbers, they set duty. So it's price is not calculating. It's Russian production increased by 10% year on year. Same time, Russian export decreased by 20% if we compare current export pace with previous year. It's not just about not straight sanctions. Yes, really, some traders avoid buy, and other ship owners avoid to go to Russian ports. They have lack of finance. Not all banks agree to finance contracts with Russia. So, but they still can't find this money. The main problem is duties. They set duties and killed their own export by these duties.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that. So also another question probably to Yegor, I guess. So we saw already 1 full month of grain exports through this corridor, and so far the dynamics has been pretty good. Do you see these growing export volumes translating into the higher local grain prices in Ukraine and supporting local farmers? Do you see already some activity in procuring new grains in Ukraine? I'm sorry, Igor, you're muted.
Okay, you should hear me now.
Yes, perfect, perfect.
Great. So I believe it depends on a trader very much. Like some traders, they have huge inventory from the previous harvest, and they would probably still be focusing on unloading this inventory on the first stage. and just doing the minimum volume of grain origination on the market. And that's obviously a huge problem for the farmers' inability to sell as much crop as they used to sell during the crop harvest pressure. I would also add that lack of financing available for trading business in general on the market also decreases the amount of how much grain can farmers sell during the harvesting season. So no farmer should expect to sell as much grain as they used to during the harvest season. And we will unlikely see much, I would say, much of increase in grain and oilseed prices because of the export volumes are going up. Because liquidity remains an issue. It's not only logistics side of the business. So at the same point of time, farmers have been selling quite actively through the cash market, and cash market is probably at its best since the 90s. As we analyze Ukrainian export through the river ports and through the railway export for the last 6 months, as we see that approximately 40–45% of the market is cash. It's like one-day companies that never existed, never done grain trading activities before. So like I would expect farmers to continue to sell a significant portion of the crop through these cash traders, which are extremely active on the market these days.
Mhm.
Igor, when you say cash market, I suppose you mean shadow market, not cash in
Well, in many cases, it's actually that farmers are being paid with real cash, or sometimes it's just cash on their accounts abroad.
Because it's just I just want to explain to the audience that on the Ukrainian agriculture market, we have specific words like cash market. It's not opposite to stock exchange. Yeah, it's really cash when they pay by cash, by printed money, which is shadow market, which is illegal.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So having that in mind, Igor, if we see that procurement volumes have been not that huge so far, and farmers shouldn't expect to sell as much grain volumes as they've used to, even though they have still some revenue streams from this cash market. So that again confirms the expectations that next year sowing volumes will decline, first of all, due to high inventory, secondly, due to lack of funds, and also, I guess, due to jump in input costs across the board. Is it right?
I would say that it is actually too early to say anything about crop planting expectations for the next year. Well, obviously, farmers have planted probably less winter wheat that they would do normally, because many farmers are just afraid to invest any money in the working capital. And for many farmers, this decision had to be made before the grain corridor has opened. But going into the spring, situation could evolve in different ways. If we see that grain corridor remains open, we could actually see higher acreage than this year, because the economics would come back. The farmer economics on the open grain corridor is much better than when farmers have to export using trucks or railway delivery using several modes of transshipments, which makes logistics to the Constanța port or any other port extremely expensive. So farm economics will improve if grain corridor remains open, and acreage could actually go up. One thing that is unlikely to change much is that corn acreage is likely to decrease more next season because high fertilizer prices they will push Ukrainian farmers to shift more to sunflower seed and soybean next spring, and that is something that is unlikely to change much, because there is little reason to expect that fertilizer prices could go down. And in Ukraine, unlike in Europe, corn is the most fertilizer intensive crop.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Well, so at the moment we have a couple of questions from the audience. We'll probably try to address them. First question would be, are there any estimates of agriculture firms that exited the market due to Russian invasion? I'm not sure if the question concerns the Ukrainian companies that have left the sector due to invasion, or probably international companies that left Russian market. But if you have any insights of both aspects, would be very grateful if you could share them. Okay.
Any international companies left Russian market, because food trading, it's not under sanctions, so all international companies still present in Russia.
Thank you for that, Igor. And have you seen any local agricultural producer left the market or like defaulted since the invasion?
You mean like if any Russian?
No. If a Ukrainian producer defaulted and or trader exited the market after the invasion.
Well, definitely there are lots of defaults among the farmers. That's obviously the case, especially among the farmers who have some of their land being occupied. That is the case, and not all of them are able to deliver products that they have to deliver under the prepayments that many traders have already made to them. That's totally true. And we also have seen that many international grain traders that would be our competitors, they have shifted their operations more to buying any type of goods outside of Ukraine on FOB basis, or like CPT, but not carrying any inventory risk in Ukraine. So it is likely that trading business will remain less international in Ukraine as well.
Perfect.
I absolutely agree to Yegor, because from the ABCD companies, just one already started to trade with Ukraine. By the way, all of them have offices in Ukraine, but no from them using grain corridors still, and just a few using railways to deliver grain to Europe. Most of them just sitting and waiting.
Hope they'll get inspired by our progress soon, and will return to our market. So, and we have another question from the audience. So, how hard will it be for Ukraine to get back its grain market share after the war, after there are some issues despite recovering the harvest volumes? Well, definitely where the grain export volumes from Ukraine have slid recently, how hard it's going to be for us to regain our markets.
Well, I could probably comment on that my view is that grain is a commodity, and there is no such thing as market share in the long term. So we would, as long as we produce enough commodity, we would be able to find a buyer. Obviously, some countries, they do prefer grain of a specific origin, but this issue, this preference, just like a question of price premium of several dollars per ton, but it's not like market share. Like Ukraine will always be able to sell as much grain as it can export.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Another question for you, Yegor, from Roman Topoluk. Roman asks, what are your anticipations of how much corn acreage could decrease next season?
I guess it is an open question. No one can really answer at this stage, but definitely as we see that gas price is high, fertilizer is expensive, and delivery of fertilizer is complicated, farmers will be cutting corn acreage by some percentage, but probably it couldn't go down like too much because there are still crop rotation issues, but many farmers will try to switch to soybean and sunflower seeds where they can.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And probably to conclude our findings so far, William, going back to you, given what we have already discussed with Alena and Yegor, have your view on Ukrainian crop outlook and export outlook for this season and next season improved or deteriorated? Probably you've become more optimistic about Ukraine.
Yeah, no, obviously it's been a lot, quite volatile expectations with the war. The grain corridor, I mean, just in my personal opinion, the grain corridor is probably going better than I initially expected. So that's good to see, because I thought the insurance and risk issue might be significant, but the ships are obviously getting in and out. And like they both mentioned, the corn crop is a bit better than expected. The planting for the corn crop was better than the initial fear that it was going to be less than half of the initial expectations. So obviously the farmers are willing to get in there. It's just a question of whether or not they have the resources to produce the quality. And I totally agree. Ukraine will regain market share with whatever they can produce and effectively ship. So I don't think there's any risk of that. And global prices separately are going to be high and remain high. So even you're not going to see a situation where, oh, the grain corridor is going better than expected and that will cause prices to drop. I don't think that's it. It'll just actually just be a benefit of being able to sell that grain at the high global prices.
Perfect. William, thank you very much for that. And Alena, Yegor, coming back to you, do you agree that agriculture market will remain supported and prices will remain high, possibly helping Ukraine to offset part of the impact of the war?
Due to high prices, Ukraine do not offset themselves because a big proportion of this price it's logistic, which is not Ukrainian part of business. Ukrainian farmers now get from like around $300 per metric ton in port of Constanta, just $100. All the rest is logistic. To deliver grain from the center of Ukraine to port of Constanta costs from $150 up to $180 per metric ton. And this grain can be in a queue on the border up to months with a half.
Yes, definitely. But only thanks to these high international prices, this logistic cost still could be at least to some extent viable. Were the like corn price in Constanta $200 per box, I guess we would be in much worse situation.
Yes, so that's why we expect that grain corridor will work even after these 120 days.
Perfect.
If you grain in Ukrainian ports, it's much cheaper than to Romania, and you haven't wait to reload your grain from Ukrainian wagon to European size type of wagon. So it's faster and much cheaper.
Perfect. And coming back to your earlier statement that you expect still high fertilizer prices to dominate like market sentiment and drive the prices. So do you also expect grain prices to remain high until end of this year and possibly next year?
Fertilizers and all chemicals do two things. Firstly, it's very important to use fertilizers to get better yields. If you do not use fertilizers, your yields will be lower, and it means that you produce less. And as well, the quality of your grain, especially if you talk about wheat, is very dependent on weather and on fertilizers. Will you produce milling wheat or feed wheat. It just depends not on your seeds. It depends only, seeds are same. But what you will produce, it depends on the God. Only God knows. So using more fertilizers in the right time, it's very important to get better quality wheat.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So, and we have one more question from the audience. Probably I will have the final question before concluding our session today. The question is, how did access to money market changed for Ukrainian growers, and what do you expect for the next year? Igor, probably this one gonna be for you.
Well, I would say there are like two sides of money markets for the Ukrainian farming industry. One is kind of indirect or like direct financing from foreign borrowers, foreign banks and financial institutions. That's probably like $3, $4, maybe up to $5 billion in total. All this money would dream to exit Ukraine as soon as they can, probably accept financial development institutions that are really supportive of Ukraine. Commercial banks, they do support Ukrainian borrowers, but still they would obviously go out of Ukraine to as much as they can at the first opportunity. So there is definitely is likely to be a decrease of financing available, and probably international traders would be one of the first to withdraw amount of financing available to Ukraine as a market from kind of internal coffers. Second part is local financing, which have always been more important to farmers, grain producers, but it is also becoming more important for trading business as well. The amount of money available there has probably increased with the government programs launched this spring, but it is far lower than whatever amount of money has been withdrawn through the trading business, which have been available for the farmers indirectly, because like we as a trader and every other large grain traders, we have always been financing farmers by making prepayments, and this is kind of indirect financing for all the farm producers, and it is not available this season for the obvious reasons that we cannot get this additional money from the banks. So liquidity will decrease, will continue to decrease for Ukrainian farming as a whole industry, but at the same time, many farmers have made a significant amount of money during the last two highly profitable crops. So I would say there should be a significant redistribution of the like farmland operators in the market, because some of them have extremely good liquidity issues with lots of cash being parked somewhere, and they could buy less efficient farmers and be able to take over land if they are willing to continue to invest in the farming business in Ukraine. So I would say that liquidity will be lower, and farmers will have to learn how to live with lower amount of working capital than they used to.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We've already talked for an hour and a half, but given how complicated this topic is, I guess we could have used at least the same time to dig even deeper into this question. But I guess we've done a great job. Thank you very much, William, for the great presentation. Thank you very much, Alena and Igor, for your contributions. It was great great discussion. So for our audience, if you have any follow-up questions, please send us over. We will try to redirect it to our panel, but probably we will conclude here. Again, thank you very much, and thanks to our audience, and please stay tuned and wait for our next events.
Thank you for the invitation. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and have a great evening, and stay safe. Thank you.